My name's David, and the Chronological Bible Reading for September 27th is Nehemiah chapters 6 and 7. And before we get started today, let's back up to the last couple verses of chapter 5 to set the context of today's study. These last two verses show us the character of Nehemiah, and we didn't have time to get to them yesterday. Nehemiah didn't demand the food allotment that was set aside for him as governor over the people because he couldn't stand the idea of having too much to eat while the people didn't have enough. He wasn't leading for the sake of getting rich. He wasn't using his position of authority to better himself, but it was truly in order to serve. We all, as Christians, should use this example that's given to us in Scripture and put the needs of others before our own at all times. Nehemiah also prayed in the very last verse of chapter 5 that God would remember him with favor because of the sacrifices he made for his people. Our temptation in the flesh is very often for people to remember our sacrifices. But it's far more important that we look to God, who is eternal and who will reward completely. Nehemiah was focused always on the needs of the mission and the needs of the people. His life exemplified loving God and loving people in that order. But he wasn't gullible or naive. A lot of people seem to think these days that being a Christian means that we're supposed to be passive and weak. Nehemiah was a strong leader who stood up in the face of opposition, and he was discerning when his enemies tried to deceive him. He sacrificed his own well-being and reputation to make sure the mission went forward. In chapter 6, verse 2, when those people who were standing against the rebuilding of the wall of Jerusalem found out that the project was nearing completion, they tried to get Nehemiah to go and meet with them, but he knew they were planning harm, so he rejected their repeated requests. After 4 attempts, they tried a new tactic by sending Nehemiah the same message, only this time it was in the form of an open letter, so that the messengers who handled it and everyone who was around them would be able to read it and then spread the rumors amongst the people Nehemiah was leading. This was a clear attempt to incite fear and mutiny. Nehemiah openly replied, "There's nothing to these rumors you're spreading. You're inventing them in your own mind." A question for us to consider is how much gossip and slander could be eradicated from Christian circles if strong leaders would openly address and oppose untruths. Nehemiah understood the motivations of the enemy to spread fear and intimidation, and their end goal was stopping the work on the wall. Certainly his clarity of purpose in that knowing God had sent him to rebuild that wall helped, because it was very clear who was opposed to that mission and who was busy supporting it. Perhaps one of the reasons a lot of Christians today are hesitant to stand up against the untruths of the enemy is because they're not sure what God is up to and what God has specifically called them to in their own lives. If you understand the mission that God is calling you to, you will very clearly understand who is opposed to that mission and who is supportive. We today need to understand the signs of the time we're in and what God is doing in these times. This will inform us of how to pray and where to position ourselves spiritually, but also politically. Right now, in September of 2024, God is on a mission to remove the wicked from power and authority worldwide. God is exposing the secret sins of those in power and those who have been using their positions to suppress truth and oppress people rather than to help them. Sadly, in America, people are so politically divided that even when the sins are exposed, many of us dismiss them because the revelations are not consistent with our worldview. If that is the case, then shame on us. Many Christians today have bought into the lies of the media and the politically corrupt, so they're deceived as to what issues and on which side of those issues Christians should be taking a stand. If you're agreeing with what you're seeing on the television, reading in the newspaper, or hearing from people who have gotten wealthy as politicians, you just might be on the wrong side. And like the Pharisees who were opposed to Jesus because he came against their worldview, you might find yourself fighting against God and against truth. Nehemiah understood 500 years before it was written that God had not given him a spirit of fear, but one of power, one of love, and of self-control, or a sound mind. The question might arise for you, why did God allow the enemies of the mission to continue harassing Nehemiah and all of the people who were busy working on the wall if he wanted that done? At least part of the answer is that God allows us to be in uncomfortable situations because they develop character in his people, and God is far more concerned with our character than he is with our happiness. In verse 15, the wall is completed, and when the enemies of the Israelites heard this, they were intimidated and they lost their confidence. The thing they had been trying to incite in the Israelites came upon them when God's work was completed. So it will be today. There is a spirit of fear and intimidation against the people of God who are willing to stand up for the truth. But don't let it dissuade you or discourage you. Keep doing what God has called you to do, and at the end of the day, the enemy will be the one who is afraid. Even after this, many of the people among the Jews continued trying to intimidate Nehemiah because they were politically allied with the enemies of God. Just like Christians today who are aligned with the liberal agenda, they continue to fight against truth and try to intimidate Christians who are taking a stand for truth and for justice. In chapter 7, Nehemiah puts his brother Hanani in charge of Jerusalem because he was a faithful man who feared God more than most others. If you desire promotion, try being a faithful person who fears God more than most others. In verse 5, God put into Nehemiah's mind to assemble the nobles, officials, and people to be registered by a genealogy. These genealogies may be somewhat difficult for some of us to read, but they are important and they lend credibility to the historical accuracy of these writings. What is clear from studying the scriptures is that these words are from God, and that knowing them will bring us to a greater understanding and knowledge of the truth. And we should all have a desire for the truth. May God bless you as you continue seeking him. May he give you a love for his word and a desire to know him in greater intimacy. May he fill you with the Spirit and give you peace. Thank you for being on this journey with me. We'll see you tomorrow.